Hi, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the original title of this talk was Privacy Threat Modeling 101. We wanted to get a little more specific, so if you read that, this is the same talk as that. We changed the title to capture what we're going to be doing in this session, which is thinking about the question, where do threat models come from? And we will also be challenging some implicit assumptions that go into the threat modeling process. Okay, so here are some grounding questions for the session. We want to be thinking about how do privacy researchers engage in the process of threat modeling? Where do the underlying assumptions of threats and the implicit assumptions about the populations who are facing those threats come from? Where do we form our ideas about these things? And how might we bring the threat modeling process back to basics such that our work addresses the specific needs of the population that it claims to serve? So we want to start with a couple of examples, and these are more cryptography focused examples. However, the general gist of the implicit assumptions and the underlying kind of mismatches that occur between real threat models and the ones that we think about are pretty universal to anybody who works on threat modeling in the privacy space. So the first example I want to talk about is grassroots organizing. And this is a pretty intense threat model where activists, leakers, and whistleblowers, they have to think about device compromise as a primary piece of the threat that they face. And we would think about this as compromise security. So cryptographers typically consider post-compromise security, or what happens in the event of a corruption. And the first thing that comes to mind as a cryptographer is forward secrecy. So a key compromise at time t does not allow an adversary to go back and decrypt messages that were sent before time t. That's kind of a high-level definition. And the implicit assumption here is that the adversary is going to be dragnet collecting a bunch of ciphertexts while they are being sent, and then later is going to corrupt the device to get the key, and then go back and attempt to decrypt all those ciphertexts that they collected over the wires, kind of as a middleman. But in reality, the biggest threat here for device compromise is arrest, and specifically compromise in a semi-locked or unlocked state. And that can reveal contacts, messaging history, metadata documents, etc. Like all of that just gets revealed in plain text if the adversary, in this case law enforcement, is able to seize a device and in a semi-locked or unlocked state, and even sometimes locked, depending on details we won't get into. So this leads activists to consider this notion of kind of full compromise security. That they want to know when a compromise happens. They want to be able to remotely delete things on people's phones. And so in reality, this is kind of an implicit assumption focused on arrest and focused on the reality of what happens during arrest. And Lucy will talk about our second example.
Yeah, so with this next example, this comes from a personal anecdote from a project that I was working on. So we were working on creating a note sharing app for a student run group that supports survivors of sexual assault at Brown. And at a high level, they wanted to be able to store and share notes. However, they were worried about the risk of someone, potentially a perpetrator, issuing a subpoena for this data that contains details about various sexual assaults. So even if this data is encrypted, there were concerns about compelled decryption. And this is when an individual would then have to decrypt, would be forced to decrypt the encrypted content. So we proposed encrypting the notes using deniable encryption. And deniable encryption enables a ciphertext to be decrypted to two or more plain texts using different keys. So this would mean that they could respond to a subpoena by providing a key that does properly decrypt a ciphertext, but the underlying plain text would be something unrelated. So, however, once we talked to a lawyer, it was clear that this was a total mismatch for the application. So we were defending against a case where a perpetrator might sue a survivor and a subpoena would be issued for these notes. A judge would know the underlying plain text or something about the underlying plain text in that it represents notes about events that they might have some details about already. And because of this, we were told that providing a key that decrypts as something unexpected, this could actually endanger the survivor and be seen as purposefully lying in a court of law. So although deniable encryption made sense in theory, the cryptography made sense, In this application, it just did not align at all with the realities of the legal system.
So we want to bring those examples into a think, pair, discuss activity that's hands-on. And what's going to happen is we'll have these 3 events that are going to be in shorter chunks now because we're a little bit shorter on time. So where it says 5 minutes, we're going to do 3 minutes. And the thinking section is first. So this will just be to yourself as a reflective activity. When you sit down to start a new project, you're just going to think about, how do you determine the threat model? Like, what pieces of tangible evidence goes into threat modeling decisions? And then what might be some implicit assumptions that go into those decisions? And once you've kind of reflected on your own process, try to think about whether you have noticed any examples of mismatches between threat models in research and threat models in practice that you might have encountered in your own field or come across in a different field. And if so, what are they? So we'll take a few minutes to just think about that on our own. And then we're gonna get into pairs. So that's whomever you're sitting next to. Introduce yourself if you haven't met this person yet, and share your examples from question 1B. So you're sharing mismatches between threat models in research and in practice. And think about together, you can kind of discuss what implicit assumptions might have created the mismatches in your examples. Finally, we're going to come together and discuss as a group some key insights of what you learned from reflecting and discussing these topics. And then we can think about, how accurately do our collective threat modeling processes reflect the needs of populations that our work claims to serve, and kind of why do we think this is? And how might we reimagine the threat modeling process to address those implicit assumptions and introduce more tangible evidence into the process? So before I open it up for this activity, I just wanted to check and make sure are there any questions, like logistically, or any questions about what we went over before we start the activity?
Anyone in the room has a question, thing that should be clarified? 1, 2, 3. No.
Okay, great. In that case, I have this timer. I hope it works. Okay. So just take some individual reflection time, and if you feel like jotting down notes, you can jot down notes. Otherwise, we will resume when this gets down to, like, just under 2 minutes.
You have 1 more minute for your thinking part.
Okay, so we're gonna wrap up the thinking kind of internal reflection piece, and I think some folks might have already started on the pairing. So if you haven't introduced yourself to your partner sitting next to you, introduce yourself and then just discuss some of the things you were thinking about for 1B. And I think hopefully it will let me refresh this. Oh, I can just put it back to the beginning. Okay, yeah. So again, another 3 minutes for the pairing discussion. Okay, so that's about time for the pairing. Hopefully you enjoyed that smaller discussion, and now we're going to move into a larger group discussion where hopefully our facilitators in person will be passing around a microphone to those who would like to speak so that we can all hear you. And yeah, so the key, just to recap the discussion points, could be something you learned from your reflection and discussion. It could be something that's going towards answering one of these second two bullet points, like how accurate do you see the threat modeling process? And then how can we reimagine that process to fill in some of those gaps between the implicit assumptions and like the reality of the tangible evidence in certain cases?
And we'd love it to be a discussion. So don't point questions only to me, but also to everyone else here, and give your views in. Respond to each other as well. Yes. Okay.
Oh, it's me? Sorry, I thought you raised your hand. Sorry, I came here late, but one of the things that I wanted to mention when I read like that you're doing this on threat model is I was reading this paper in sociologists in Australia, and they were discussing domestic violence, and one of the things that they said, and one of the paper talked about like IoT devices and how they are used in like stalking and terrorizing and all of that, and like one of the conclusions that they come up with is like maybe like the PETS people, when they consider threat model, is considered like the violent partner as part of the threat model, because it's not just like an edge case. In most countries, like, you know, high probability that women face these, yeah, which I thought is interesting.
Yeah, so I won't go into detail, but I actually have a very systematic threat modeling process that I use. So I'm not quite sure if it fits into what you were wanting to achieve here. Like in terms of tangible evidence, so one of the things, and this goes to the mismatch, is I see a mismatch between researchers looking at hypothetical threat actors and not thinking about their motivations. And this goes into when I'm doing an analysis, more like a risk assessment, not a decision about how to do threat modeling, but the risk analysis is how motivated is the threat actor and what evidence is there to support that they are actually motivated to commit this harm or not.
So, yeah, actually, I was going to say something else, which I still will, but in following on that, yeah, I think adversary goals is a major aspect that is often left out. We had a paper a couple of years ago, we talked about when the man really is out to get you, and you need to distinguish between what we call the hoovering adversary, which they touched on, where you're just trying to gather up everything and then see what you can get out of it. That might be a real adversary sometimes, but sometimes they don't want to see everything. They have some reason to be going after this particular thing, and they're going to put lots of resources right there, and if that's not part of your model, then you're going to not get things right. What I was going to note was that I think there's sort of an implicit assumption in the question, which is also sort of missing, which is it depends what you're designing against. You know, we used to use this example when we first came up with onion routing, where we said, look, nobody's doing this right now, but imagine if in the future you could order a pizza on the web, you know, and the point is, are you designing against a threat of something that's going on now and you're trying to figure out how to counter it, or are you trying to think about technologies that are emerging and how they're going to be used and what threats might come up there? Because you're going to come up with different answers depending on whether you're trying to deal with a future technology that or an emerging technology versus and that new threats that, you know, maybe don't exist yet in that form versus you know, things that are happening right now and how to design against them.
So we were discussing when you're developing some new secure or private system, your threat models can fit your project. So for example, in networking, you'll have a few well-known examples of threat models, and implicitly we understand the parameters along which our adversaries can be distinguished and some severity differences between those. So your project might start from a use case or a technology that you want to adapt to a use case or show that it can be useful by composition with something else. And so you'll have a threat adversary in mind, which you're trying to develop your system in light of, and then you'll realize that actually your system can't be usable or useful if you have an attacker that strong. And so you weaken your threat model, and then you show that you can actually do something useful under that threat model, and then you leave it to later on an extension to your work to re-strengthen it and trying to make it useful for another one. So that's an issue. I think in practice, researchers like us or engineers will try and make something before we think about what the threat model is, and then we try and fit it to the threat model afterwards.
It would probably also be interesting to hear from people who engaged with community members when they construct and think about threat models.
Yeah, On that note, yeah, I think that in the last sort of 5-6 years or so, my approach to this has changed a lot because, you know, I'm not always designing systems for myself. I'm often, you know, in getting the input from the imagined, you know, user community, et cetera, that you are designing for about what their threats are, what their concerns are, what their constraints are, I think is very important to have as input. So I do a lot more, you know, focus grouping, surveys, qualitative interviews, just to understand really like what is the context of this situation, and then, you know, people can't give you necessarily their threat model because they don't have necessarily the context and knowledge of that. But if you can get a combination of this background knowledge and some insight from the community of their issues, then you can do a lot better at threat modeling than if you're just that's the evidence, I think, that is really important to understand kind of what concerns are salient.
Yeah, I just wanted to contribute like kind of something from quasi my personal experience, which is interacting with lots of people kind of like in China who want to talk securely over the internet. One really interesting observation is that they actually like non-end-to-end encrypted cloud-based tools like Telegram precisely because they can just delete it off of their device and install it again, and then their messages are still there. And in their threat model, the police checking their phone is a much bigger risk than the servers being untrusted, which is something we don't really think about when we design like you know, end-to-end encrypted messaging protocols and research and things like that. Generally, we assume that the user's device is more trustworthy than the server running the service. But actually, in a lot of cases, people want something that they can just run entirely in the cloud. They have a username and password they remember in their brain. They close their browser, and there's no evidence they ever used the software before. But like, that's something that sounds insecure and untrustworthy in a kind of more research-like threat model to have everything run on the cloud and not on your computer. So that's just a random observation I had.
To add a bit to what Rachel said, users are not that good at threat modeling themselves, but still we need to interact with them to like get the final thing out. But one thing that I see they are very good at is when we came with them with like a threat model and they say, direct us, this is nonsense, this doesn't work for me. And a lot of this process were into the fact of we trying a new model, going to them and they say to us why this does not work in reality, and repeating this process over and over again.
I think what is often missing in a threat model is also that the system is not designed to be usable, and then there are threats due to to usability issues, like we saw with Tor, for instance, and users didn't understand that Tor does mean that the data it's not end-to-end encrypted, and then sensitive information leaked by journalists in Sweden, for instance. There were these cases, so that should be also a part of the threat model somehow, even so it's hard to say how to address it.
I have two comments. One connected to what you were saying about China. I've seen a similar situation, but different, doing training with activists. Like, we tend to recommend always Signal. And then you talk, for example, with trans communities that has a lot of harassment. That is like, yeah, giving my phone number is a no-go. So they prefer things like Telegram that will allow them to just hide their phone because the threat model is completely different than the one that we come with. Another remark I wanted to bring is often also with activists is different on, we tend to think a lot on the threat model as an individual thing, and working with groups. There is like all this it matters a lot, the threat model of the group and how they will work together and what are the things that they like. It doesn't matter if someone has a private communication if the others are not having it, and if the things will be sifted. So, I don't know what I want to say there, but yeah, we were talking about that.
Thank you. We may have time for one more intervention while the next speakers start to get ready. If anyone wants to add something now at the time, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. No. Well, thank you all.